I call Jan Logie.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Green Party will be opposing the social housing reform bill. It's no surprise. While we have some lukewarm support for a couple of aspects of this bill, we are strongly opposed to many of the measures within it. This bill establishes renewable tenancies. I usually like the word renewable, but not in this situation. It shifts housing needs assessments from Housing New Zealand to MSD. It extends income-related rents to community housing organisations, but sadly also undermines their autonomy. It attempts to pretend that government is actually doing something about the problem of cold, damp housing in this country, when in fact it's just providing window dressing. Renewable tenancies, evictions by another name. 1,000 people in the first year heralded by this bill, and 3,000 in total. And that's into a housing crisis, where in Auckland alone it's estimated that we're 12,000 houses short already. Where in South Auckland the average annual turnover in private rental housing is 4 families a year, because they cannot afford to meet the market rentals. That's where a young pregnant woman was found living in her car because she was earning a few dollars over the threshold for Housing New Zealand housing and couldn't find a private rental that she could afford. Shame on this government. And as my colleague Holly Walker noted in her very compelling speech last night, which I recommend to everyone, much of the harm of private rentals comes from the churn that we see because people can't afford the rent or their landlords decide to get somebody else in and they have to move, which means that children end up moving between schools and can't become part of a learning culture. And people lose their social bonds and the connections that come from sharing your vegetables with your neighbours that enable you to get by that little much better. And that comes from when people develop community. And I've been a renter most of my life, and I've moved on average twice a year, which is just that reality of being a renter. And I can attest to that loss of community and the high cost of moving. It costs a lot to move and re-establishes yourself. And that is money that is going to be lost to the poorest families in our community, the people who can least afford it. This bill is a bloody travesty. And still, this government seems to have forgotten the point of state housing. And I would like to remind it that it was a Liberal administration under Richard Seddon that first recognised the need for state housing. You brought in state housing. Sorry, Mr Speaker, not you. The national government, a Liberal government, was the first government to bring in state housing because they recognised the growing reports of extortionate rents and squalid living conditions, and they recognised a need for the state to provide a response. And when Mr Sabin says we're whinging about this and being Liberals opposing it and we're not acknowledging your other bill to bring in extending urban limits and provide new housing, I would remind you that in the 50s the national government opposed the development of state houses on the fringes and recognising that development in the inner city was made more sense and was better for people's sustainability. This government has lost its way. You've lost your values.
Order.
And you are sorry, Mr Speaker, not you, of course. This national government has lost its way and is forgetting the people who most need your support. This government, there is one aspect of this bill that could potentially provide some help, and that is extending income-related rents to social housing, because we recognise social housing does do the job well. Wraparound services are really positive. However, I provide 3 caveats on this. One, that it needs to be an addition, and I acknowledge that this government lost 300 homes from the state sector for the first time, and that this will not be 300 houses makes a difference. That's 300 families, Mr Lotoinga, and it's sad to see them lose them.
Mr Speaker.
I call Alfred Naro.
Thank you, Mr.